Well, hello, good morning, and thanks for joining us today. So, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Lalit Wijedoru. Wijedoru, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Um, and you, what I know of you, so we met very casually at the swimming pool where we both tend to go early mornings, and we started chatting about what we do. Turns out that we have quite a bit in common in that we both used to work in the NHS. You as a paediatrician and me as a psychologist, and both of us now find ourselves doing something quite different from our previous occupation, but similar in obviously what binds us is in that we both work within the corporate setting. Yeah.
And you like swimming.
And we like swimming. That's true. So thanks so much for joining us. I thought I think it would be really valuable to hear what your experience has been, your story has been, your journey has been, both personally, yeah, and as well as your time in the NHS, and ultimately what led you to decide to leave the NHS and set up your current business, which is, as I understand it, using storytelling within the corporate setting to allow people to kind of come behind the mask, the professional mask that we all tend to wear, and bring their true self to the fore. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So it's not just businesses that I work with. I work with individuals. I work with communities, any organizations, and of course the media. So, but at the core of my business is the human story and personal narratives. That's what drives me, and I think it's very important that we celebrate all of our stories, the funny ones, the sad ones, the inspiring ones. And I absolutely believe in the power of stories to educate people, to engage people, and to inspire. And so what the world needs now, I think, is we don't need any more kind of financially successful people. I think what we need now is we need love. I think we need to connect and engage with each other in this time of great disconnect. And so what better way to do that than to go back to the way that we've been doing it for centuries, stories.
And where did that originally come from? Where did the idea come from?
So the idea, it's so there are so many. There's never one reason. There are so many. I call it like the gas. When we talk about the causes of World War One or the causes of World War Two, they talk about the gas leak across Europe, and then there are all these things that are happening and bubbling away in the background, and then you just need a spark to ignite it. So I've had. Pardon my medical terminology. I've had a lot of gas,
Yeah, okay.
and for me there were a number of sparks. So the gas is, I am as a child, I loved stories. If you think the way, how do we learn? We learn through stories. There are messages to stories. And so as a kid, I was absolutely a voracious reader, and I loved stories. And the things that I loved most were the kind of mythological stories and the folk tales, the ethnic folk tales that kind of explained our way in the world. So for example, the story of why does the sun rise in the east and set in the west? And it's the sun god with his chariot and doing this. I love the kind of Roman Greek mythology of the god of the sea, and the kind of kingdoms underneath there. So stories are very good, if we go back to our ancestors, of explaining the world to us. And so as somebody who is incurably curious about the world, stories have been my way to kind of make sense of the world. And I think many of us as humans do this, in particularly children. So this is something that has been very much with me as a child. The second thing in terms of my interest is language. I'm a third culture kid, so I've been exposed to multiple languages at home. At home, I'm from Sri Lanka originally. My parents spoke Sinhalese, which is one of the official languages of Sri Lanka.
You were born in Sri Lanka?
No, so I was born in Hong Kong. So again, exposed
God, okay.
to Cantonese as a Southern Chinese dialect, educated in English, and then I finished high school in mainland China, so Mandarin, a different Chinese language. And so language, and my parents lived in Japan before they moved to Hong Kong, so my father spoke Japanese. So language is, I've been fascinated by the evolution of language. And of course, with language is an integral part of culture, are stories. And so the other aspects of culture that I love music and I love food. So again, all these kind of things that make us humans and our human culture are very much resonate with me. And that has been a gas that has always been there in my life: music, food, language, stories. And so that has always been there. And then of course I decided to become a pediatrician. And so, still surrounded by stories and engaging children and young people. And
by the way, can we just recognise that a paediatrician does not deal with feet?
Yes. Oh yeah. You mentioned.
A paediatrician. I had an argument yesterday with my father. A paediatrician deals with children, not feet. That's a pediatrician. Something.
Podiatrist.
That one. There we go. See, and that's why my English isn't very good.
No, but then we also talked about orthopedics. Orthopedics is another medical surgical specialty, and that deals with bones. But actually, the Latin origin, orthos, pedia. Pedia means child, like with pediatrician, but orthos relates to straight. And so, because the early orthopedic surgeons, their bulk of their work was dealing with children with scoliosis, so making children straight. So there you go.
And so we're not dealing with feet.
Not dealing with feet.
And I'll let Emmanuel kind of carry on in a minute. In terms of where you started to kind of end up where you are today, how did you get into healthcare? Where, in terms of going into be a paediatrician, there we go. Where did that kind of come from? Because you're saying I love stories and everything else. Okay, he should work in the arts, like he should. Yeah.
So again, I had a very strong artistic liberal arts background. I was good at languages, I was good at history, I was good at English, and I was good at music. And so, really, if I look back at my track record in school, those are my kind of academic strengths, if you ask. Not that I wasn't good at science, I just wasn't natural at science. I was much more natural in the arts. But actually, my motivation to get into science was, to get into healthcare was actually adverse childhood experiences. Unfortunately, I'm a survivor of childhood emotional abuse quite badly. And so it was kind of those adverse childhood experiences with a parent who had severe mental health problems, domestic violence, emotional abuse, physical abuse. And so that type of environment made me want to advocate for the safety and protection of children. And so that has always been there. And so I've always been very passionate about the safety of children. But interestingly, I at school, because of my natural gravitation towards language, public speaking, arts, I was doing English, history, Chinese. Those were my kind of strong subjects. And I was actually doing work experience with a view to have a career in international organizations. I wanted to be a diplomat or work in United Nations, be an ambassador. That was the kind of trajectory I thought I was going to end up in. But I did my work experience for UNICEF, which is the United Nations Children's Fund. And there I was exposed to a vaccination program in a rural province of China. And what I saw was maternal literacy. If women are educated, they are more likely to vaccinate their children. They are more likely to understand how to treat their children when they have severe diarrhea and vomiting, and therefore child survival will be higher. There'll be fewer days off work, and actually this has an impact on the economics of the country. So, and for somebody who had a grandmother who raised four children as a single mother, the fact that she was literate made a huge impact and made a huge difference to the outcomes for that family. My mother being the first person to go to university from our family. And so for me, maternal literacy is really, really big. And I'm from a country, Sri Lanka, which, pub quiz question, the first female prime minister in the world is from Sri Lanka. Her name is Siddhamava Bandaranaike. And so again, this whole kind of matriarch, female empowerment, maternal literacy, and how this affects the outcomes for children and the economy, that kind of was like a light bulb moment for me.
That is not something you think about either. It's just, as you said that, I was kind of like, oh yeah.
Oh yes.
It's something you wouldn't really... I don't know. I've never really thought on too much.
In the UK, you take maternal literacy, you take the education of girls and women for granted, but in globally, maternal literacy and the role of women is, as you can imagine, very, very different. And so, biologically and worldwide, the majority of childcare is provided by the mother. And so as a pediatrician, who do you deal with the most? Mothers, on the whole. don't get me wrong, whenever I see a father come with a child, and Emmanuel, I know we've spoken about the challenges of overnight sleepovers with your children, but but overall, the role of the woman is very important to me. And so I thought, there I was 17, 18 having a decision about whether I apply for international relations or whether I apply for medicine. And I thought, actually, if I could be a pediatrician advocating for the advancement of women as a way to protect children, that would be a great way to do it.
And when you say maternal literacy, is that literacy of how am I trying to phrase this? Just looking after how to look after a child, or kind of everything?
Literacy is the ability to read and write, and so if a woman is literate, they are more likely to be able to understand written instructions, for example, how to look after their children. They're more likely to be receptive to public health information, such as vaccinate your children. So the education of women is key to our survival as a species and for the protection of our children. And so, yes, the ability of a woman, of a female, a mother, to read and write.
Wow. That is really not something you think of.
And so you link that back to stories. A mother who can read to their children is powerful. But if you think about the ways that our ancient ancestors communicated stories, it was through drawings.
Yeah.
It was round the campfire. It was using
word of
mouth. It was through songs and music. And, the stories of our food, if you think about, how certain foods came about. If you look at the story of coronation chicken, something very, very common in the UK, that's a colonial story. It's the British Raj, the British Empire in India, the influence of kind of certain spices and curry seasoning with mayonnaise and things. That's how fusion happens. So even our food tells stories. So yeah.
Crikey.
There's a bit of a segue. There's a couple of questions I had. One in particular about, you called yourself a third culture kid, and how that impacted you, and how you think it impacts children with such a similar background. In that, is it possible to feel rooted? Is there a need to be rooted in one of the three or the multiple cultures that you have, or is it all just richness? Is it just benefits to having this wide variety of of different cultures? But maybe because of time constraints, I'll make a segue to something else, and if we have time, I'll go back to that. But we've spoken a little bit, at the swimming pool, and you've told me a little bit about your experience of working in the NHS, and I think what you just touched upon is quite central in perhaps your discontent, having worked in the NHS, and that is clearly, listening to you, there's this drive to have an impact on a certain scale, through these programs, and be it UNICEF or be it the UN, or increasing, maternal literacy around the world. And I know just a little bit from you about your experience of working as a pediatrician. So if I'm correct, you've worked for more or less 20 years as a pediatrician in the NHS. And then it came to a point where you decided to move on from that. Can we delve into that just a little bit? What does a pediatrician do, in general? What does your day-to-day life look like as a pediatrician? And then what were the difficulties that you personally encountered in your role as a pediatrician that were one of the reasons why you decided to leave the NHS?
So a pediatrician is a doctor who looks after children, not feet. And so the definition of children can vary, but normally it either goes up to the age from 0 to 16, as in the UK, when you're legally supposed to be in full-time education. Some places extend up to 18, but essentially children and young people before you become an adult. So that's the sphere of influence that pediatricians have. So pediatricians, of course, as that age group suggests, look after a period of rapid growth and development. So as a pediatrician, as a general pediatrician, your patients could range from anything from a extremely premature baby to a challenging, grumpy teenager. So, quite a wide range, and everything in between. And so this phase of growth and development is massive. But within pediatrics, like with many other specialties in adult medicine, you have different specialties, for example, like cardiology or different types of surgery or neurology. And so you do have general pediatricians, which kind of look after all aspects of children in that age range, but you also have pediatric specialists, which look at a particular area, a specific area. So I'm a pediatric specialist, but the area that I specialized in was emergency medicine. So in a way, there is an element of being a general pediatrician, looking at all the kind of common problems that you see in children, like the kind of see and treats kind of quick fix problems. But the difference between a pediatric emergency specialist and a general pediatrician is that we have received extra training in trauma, as in like major physical trauma, road traffic accidents, that type of thing. So to be able, and of course we have specialist training in the management of the critically unwell child in the first, what we call the golden hour, the first hour of a child becoming unwell. So that could include sepsis. It can also include like severe asthma, of course, road traffic accidents. So the critically unwell child. And so as a pediatric emergency specialist, we have to liaise with lots of our specialist colleagues. So unfortunately, some of our children are so critically unwell that we need to stabilize them in the emergency department and then transfer them to our pediatric intensive care units, where they're looked after by intensive care specialists in children. And of course, we need assistance from people like pediatric surgeons, radiologists, orthopedics surgeons, as well as different medical specialties. So it is having a broad area of understanding pediatrics, but with specialist interest in the critically unwell child. So that's what I do.
Specifically emergency.
Yeah.
Right.
So my consultant jobs worked in a children's hospital, which has an emergency department. So we see nothing but children, and that can range from everything from the common sniffly nose right through to a child in cardiac arrest.
Now, what was the experience of that for you, doing that for 20 years in a very kind of acute setting with high stress levels, life and death type scenarios with decisions needing to be made? How's that been for you?
So I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie. I'm somebody who thrives on that kind of stress of delivering a service. But my main motivation is to make sure that the critically unwell children are managed well to improve their outcome. So, of course, luckily in the UK, the number of critically unwell children is low. If we compare the adult population, the number of patients who end up in the resuscitation area in adults is much higher, because adults have strokes and heart attacks and things like that. Luckily, children don't end up in resus all that often in comparison. But when they do, I want to make sure that they are packaged properly. But of course, the threshold for seeking medical advice about your child is much, much lower than compared to yourself. If you had a headache, you'd go for it for like a week before you do anything like that. But if your child complains of a headache, you may be in looking for a pediatric opinion much earlier than that. So a lot of our work is dealing with what we call the worried well. And so for the challenges of a job in pediatric emergency medicine is balancing the volume of the worried well and being able to sift out the potentially very unwell children from that pool, but in addition to prioritizing the children who are critically unwell. And of course,
hated me. I was always trying to get off school, going into the doctors.
Oh yes.
I'm sure you've seen so many of those. Yeah. I was just thinking as you said that, I was like, the amount of times I've tried to pull sickies when I was younger. And
the threshold that your parents had for getting you checked out, because forbid that it was you actually did have appendicitis, they would never live with themselves,
Yeah.
So
I can imagine. I'd be like, I can't go to school today, and I'd head against radiator, things like that. So, I mean, that's high pressure though. That's like, you don't really hear many emergency doctors. When you do hear emergency doctors speak, or doctors, refer to themselves as adrenaline junkies,
Mhm.
because that's not kind of seen as something that would be, adrenaline junkies, Red Bull, jump out of a plane. But when you were just saying that, I can imagine, I mean, having like, parents there and something bad is going, when it's that really high pressure, I can imagine that is like, you kind of lock in.
Absolutely. So again, my motivation is protect children.
Yeah.
And when you have a critically unwell child, and it's challenging because looking after, interesting, people think that looking after children must be very hard. Dealing with children is, I'm not saying it's not hard, but it's actually harder dealing with their carers. It's harder dealing with parents, and even harder grandparents.
Oh my God.
And so when you combine the vulnerability of a child who is unwell, and your desire to look after them, but also the emotional challenge of dealing with worried carers of that child, and then managing your staff to make sure that you are performing efficiently, but then also thinking about liaising with colleagues, and so if we talk about workplace culture, and I'm sure many professions can identify, different specialties have different cultures. You can almost have a stereotype of what an orthopedic surgeon is like, or what a dermatologist is like, and so trying to merge the role of an emergency medicine doctor is that you've got to kind of almost be a conductor and orchestrator to kind of make sure that all those elements are conducted correctly in order to deliver the right outcome for that child.
But then in the NHS, there's a reality in that there's limited resources. And maybe I'm reading in between the lines, or I'm just fast forwarding a little bit. But I assume there's a certain frustration in that dealing with the worried world is taking resources away that you would much rather, and there's a necessity for that, redirect to those who are critically unwell and actually need the help.
That is a really important part of my frustration of working as a pediatric emergency medicine specialist. And so one of the aspects is, why do people leave jobs? One of them is because maybe you're not doing what you thought that you were going to be doing. And so, rightly or wrongly, I thought that as a pediatric emergency medicine specialist, that yes, of course, I'll be dealing with critically unwell children. I absolutely understood that we will be dealing with a lot of the worried well. That is part of the job. That was to be expected. But as time has gone on, particularly the NHS, and unfortunately with the changes in the public perception, and also the accessibility and provision of primary care and GPs, rightly or wrongly, people are now wanting pediatric opinions for their children. And and again, I'm sure that the Royal College of GPs may argue, and the Royal College of A&E may also argue, but actually this, to me, in my perception, is the trend is that is moving towards a more North American model, that if I have a problem with my child, I want to see I want to see somebody with child experience. And this is not to say, and with all respect to my primary care GP colleagues, many of them are very experienced with children, but parents would rather see somebody who only sees children. If you see
why? But why do you think that is?
Why?
Yeah.
I think with a North American model, I think with so much of what is happening in healthcare often is parallel to what's happening in other healthcare settings, and in other healthcare settings, other Western healthcare settings. People are moving towards specialists rather than generalists.
But there's also another case of the culture and the media, because when one out of the thousands of cases that have gone through a GP and have been dealt with appropriately, and the child is back home safe, and the right thing was to put them on some Calpol and let them rest. God forbid that this one child, potentially had sepsis, and then it does, get pushed to the front pages of, many news outlets. Oftentimes there is a culture of seeking to blame, whomever is, supposedly to blame, and I think it's a pressure that doctors feel. I can think of a few cases that have recently been published in the newspapers. And I think that my sense is that a lot of professionals within the NHS operate under fear, and that the stress that comes with their job isn't so much a stress of dealing with the medical condition, but is more to do with everything outside of that. Is
fear of litigation,
complaints,
media exposure.
Your notes are almost more important than the
your
work
treatment.
you've done, because if it's not written, it doesn't count. And then again, going back to this culture of blame. Why? Because to me, as an outsider, so I come from mainland Europe, where we have a different culture when it comes to medical healthcare. There is far less blame put on the individuals within the system, and I feel, and that's probably going to rub some people the wrong way, but that this idea of the NHS almost being a holy house, or something that cannot be touched, and it can never be put at fault. The NHS is almost sacrosanct, and so if something goes wrong, it cannot be the system. It must be someone somewhere. My experience of working in that system is that it is not the reality which is lived by the professionals that work within this setting. And I think it's important for us to be able to be open and honest about that. And to your point of taking off the mask, I think there's a lot of fear in discussing this topic. Fear of retribution, fear of complaints, pressure from the bodies that we registered with, whichever they may be, the General Medical Council, GMMC, or any other, depending on the specialty. And so I wanted to broach this subject today with truth, courage, and honesty, because ultimately, here we are. The both of us have left the NHS. From one day to another. That's a combined 30 years of experience that is no longer available through the NHS. And we haven't left because there's a better pay package out, somewhere else. None of us, but I think that applies to all professionals working within the health sector. We don't choose these professions because we want to make money. Otherwise, all of us have the intellect to work in different, much better paid jobs. We do it because it's a calling, because we care about people, we want to help them. That's the true calling of people who go into the healthcare sector. And so what is it in the UK that leads people with experience to come to a point where they leave? One of the things that we've discussed, again, casually, is this idea of moral injury. Can you share with me your experience of that?
So for me, moral distress is caused by when, I can speak from a healthcare professional point of view, when a healthcare professional is unable, for whatever reason, to provide the care that they want for their patient. And I think that many people leave the healthcare profession, and many healthcare profession, because of unresolved or unrelenting moral distress, and kind of unhealed moral distress will lead to moral injury. It's almost this permanent scar that you hold inside you. And part of my journey into storytelling came from my own experiences with moral distress. And so when we cannot provide the care that we want, so going back to that scenario of the worried well, what was happening was the number of worried well was just expanding so much in terms of the proportion of the patients that we saw. As you said, we're not able to provide quality care to the children who were needing it because we were judged with NHS targets on how we were dealing with the very worried well. And we were one of the NHS targets is that those patients need to be seen and sorted within 4 hours. But when the bulk of those patients don't need to be seen and sorted in 4 hours because they ideally should be seen in a different setting, not an emergency department. And when you are being given pressure from above in terms of you're not meeting your targets, it's like, but we are meeting the targets of what we are setting out to do, but actually the scope of work or the bulk, the workload is actually increasing.
Mm-hmm.
So how, with the same amount of resources,
Mm-hmm.
can we provide that target to actually questionably a service population which does not need that target being met?
Well, you can't. No, that's the reality.
Yeah, and you can't. And so when, so at some point I was just thinking, well, why am I doing? I went into this to look after the worried well, yes, and critically unwell children. But when we are now doing the work of primary care, in terms of because people are voting with their feet and coming to emergency department because of access to primary care, or there are many, many reasons why people are choosing to go to a children's emergency department than going to their GP, including what we said, specialist rather than generalist, access.
Was there a
media.
noticeable difference? So over a 20-year period,
Yes,
there was a noticeable difference where from kind of start to finish where people had stopped, because I mean I'm obviously quite lucky and young and I don't have to go to the GP that often. For me locally, I've actually don't really have a problem going to the GP.
Yep.
But from what I've seen just on the news is the struggle people have getting to a GP, that you do have to wait. Problem gets worse and worse and worse, and then it's, oh shit, we've got to go to A&E now, or whichever emergency department. Do you kind of remember there was a point where it was going, what is going, like there's
no, but I mean, again, so having worked at the department, and as the years go on and you look at the numbers and the volume, it's very well documented. If you look at the number of A&E attendances, it's just rising and rising and rising. But in terms of how sick those people are, that proportion is not changing.
But this happens within mental health as well. It's again a very unpopular opinion, but schools, social service workers, mental health workers will refer to A&E when there's risk to be dealt with, and that could be from kind of minor. Say type of self-harm to the most serious presentations that ought to be seen and dealt with at A&E. But if you were an A&E doctor, I'm pretty sure that there would be a lot of frustration about just a number of children being sent to school. Why? Because the school feels, well, we need to, in a sense, cover our backs, send this child, to A&E because they've self-harmed in school, although it may be, something minor. And just, it's a systemic issue. I don't have the answer, but I do feel it's important to be able to, point to where the issues are, and I think they are deeply systemic. And if you ask me what is, keeping the NHS up and running, it is to the cost of those who work within the NHS, to the cost of their own well-being, be it physical health or mental health. I've worked with, the most exemplary and dedicated colleagues, and whilst the number of cases that came through our door, kept on growing, the resources and the team that was dealing with this number of referrals, hadn't changed from the onset of, the team being set up. And that only meant one thing, is that, yes, we kept on meeting the targets, but, to what cost? And I think that's obviously one of the reasons why people leave the NHS is they burn out for a multitude of reasons, but, that's it. There's a trade-off. And if you want to keep meeting these targets, you need to go well above and beyond.
Yes.
You can provide less of the necessary care to those who actually need it, and the issues are there, obviously.
So you touched on this thing about what are the contributing factors towards burnout. Chronic excessive workload is one of the key ones, and as you said, this over a long period of time, increasing numbers of patients that you have to see, it detracts from your quality that you can provide, given the static or even in some cases depleting resource. And so going back to moral injury or moral distress, when you are unable to provide the care that you think that your patients deserve because of whatever reasons, some of which can be organizational, some of it can be systemic, some of it, of course, can be individual or local. But for whatever it is, you are not able to provide that care, that has an impact on you.
But again, I don't work in healthcare. from what I see on the outside, the kind of main thing that you always hear people talking about with the NHS specifically is pay. It's always not getting paid, which obviously, they don't get paid enough. But that's always what the problem is kind of attributed to. It's always, we're not getting paid enough, we're not getting paid enough. There's no other problem, we're not getting paid enough. So it's interesting listening to you two speak, because if you're not getting, if you're working, or is it just down to pay?
I've spoken about this on social media already. I don't think it is about pay, and it's very nice for the media, and I say nice in inverted commas, to front that as the reason for why strikes are taking place. And don't get me wrong, I think on the face of it, many employees do feel that it is about pay, but it is pay to compensate for difficult working conditions. So if you think about an oil rig worker, why are they paid quite a high amount of money? Because they are working in very isolated conditions, in risky conditions, away from their family, antisocial, all those type of things. You are compensated for the inconvenience and impact this could have on your life. And so in the same way, NHS staff, not just patient-facing, all NHS staff are working in adverse conditions. Yes, it may not be in a rig in the middle of the North Sea, but these are adverse conditions. And so
on top of that, with little pay.
Yeah, on top of that, with little pay. So on the face of it, it is about pay, but actually, how about looking at the working conditions? And so the working conditions include thinking about how can we make the work environment more compassionate, more conducive to supporting your staff? What about professional development? What about looking at ways of reducing the workload? Could the NHS be more efficient? Is there organizational patient flow issues? For example, why is A&E being clogged up? Because of access to primary care. So it's not about the pay to the staff, but I think what's at the front of it is that we've got challenging working conditions, therefore we must be compensated for the work that we do. But if we look at it from how can we improve working conditions, maybe the argument about pay may be less.
I told Emmanuel this once. There was a businessman that I know personally, and he was talking about the NHS, and he's very, very rich business guy and knows a lot in terms of that world. And he was talking about the NHS because he personally uses it. He will use his private care as well, but he uses both. And we got into the conversation of why the NHS isn't working, and he said the problem with the NHS is it's run like a charity and it's not run like a business. And that's the first time I'd heard that, and I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at it. Is it's kind of, maybe not free for all is the right word, but it's kind of just like everyone come in, like we kind of accept everyone, and it's not run. Again, I don't know the way but doctors could have kind of worked themselves up to running a business, what the NHS is, which is that the right thing to do or not? I don't really know. Obviously, you get paid more the higher you go up. But where do you say there's any kind of truth to that? It's not. It's the NHS that isn't run right, or is it the government contributing to the NHS? What's the kind of?
I agree with the statement about being business-minded, and you need to think about customer service. Think about our
that's
service
the best
users.
way of putting customer service.
If we look at how we treat our service users, but then the other thing you also have to think about is how do you look after your staff?
Employees.
How do you look after employees? And unfortunately, the emphasis on the NHS is that, as you say, we are running our charity with volunteers almost.
Yeah.
That we're kind of paying a little stipend, but we're running on their goodwill.
You can survive just.
You can survive with this, and you are running on goodwill, but that ain't going to fly in adverse working conditions. And so, as I said, they say it's about pay, but really it's about conditions.
Just a little break. I think you need to move back a little bit from the mic.
So if I say that again, say, I can't remember what we were saying. It's about working conditions. People can talk about that they're looking to be compensated financially for difficult working conditions. But as you said, if that person said that the NHS needs to be run more like a business, think about your service users. But in addition to your service users, you also have to think about your employees and your staff. And if, as that gentleman said, if the NHS is indeed run like a charity, then essentially your employees, if you can call them that, are like volunteers.
Yeah.
And so, and sometimes it does feel like that because you're running on your goodwill. And that goodwill is being eroded rapidly.
Yeah. But as with everything, there's nothing is entirely bad and nothing is entirely good, meaning if you then look at the business model, you can go straight to North America, and then you could say, well, what's the aim of a big business? It's to maximize profits. So what happens if you run a healthcare business as a business? Well, you minimize costs. So that's one thing where you do want the most professional staff working for you. You want a great customer experience, but there's also the tendency to rack bills up, to send for all sorts of tests and scans, which may not be necessary, but the machines you've purchased or lease need to be running full time or as much as possible to offset the cost. And ultimately, a business is about maximizing profit, and customer experience is important. And I take it that the model allows for choice, but again, it's not the end all be all. If you were to go to that model, I'm sure that there's negative aspects to it just the same. But then it seems like these interventions that we provide, which is about well-being or health in general through corporations, is some sort of a middle ground, isn't it? Is where you do have a growing proportion of companies or employers paying to look after the health in all its facets of the employees. And I wonder if there's something to be said about that, whether that is, there's some debate about that.
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, when I first joined my last employer, like many organizations, we have external quality. So we have something called the Care Quality Commission, the CQC, almost like an Ofsted inspection in education. And there are lots of different domains in which a healthcare provider is judged. One of these domains is caring, how caring and compassionate they are, of course, to the service users, to the patients. And so at the time that I joined the hospital, that organization was ranked outstanding for caring. But in the same time, when it came to the staff engagement survey, just around 50% of people would recommend the same outstandingly caring organization to its service users as a place to work. So that, almost half the employees would not recommend that place to work. So here you have this mismatch that speaks volumes about the health service, of these people wanting to deliver quality, compassionate care to their patients, but their organization, they're so ambivalent about their organization that they don't recommend them as a place to work. That speaks volumes.
I don't know if we can solve the NHS problem today. I was hoping we
could.
But it's about recognizing that it's recognizing that the NHS workforce, with its volunteers have hearts and vocation and desire and drive for whatever reason to provide care. But they need to be provided the right environment for them to thrive and to do that job properly. And so when it comes to, and we're going back to that concept about business, I would say a not-for-profit business, but I agree with you. I mean, the reason I don't do private healthcare because I don't believe in, creating this demand for health. I want to say, no, actually, this is only what you need. But, if there's a manager at the saying, but we need to have the CT machine running 24 hours a day and to generate money, I'm not going to be doing that. The reason I went to pediatrics is I don't believe in subjecting children to unnecessary tests and treatments. And again, working in pediatric medicine, a lot of the work is the worried well. Educating families, reassuring children is to say how you can use self-care. You don't need pills and interventions for a lot of pediatric problems. A lot of them are kind of self-resolving, self-limiting, or just some simple remedy. And so subjecting children to expensive diagnostic tests, painful diagnostic tests and treatments is not in my my values. And so,
Have you noticed, this is my own observation, but when you work in the NHS for a certain amount of time, you start as a clinician, and I think it's true on every level, to merge resource managing with clinical opinion, meaning that as a doctor, I never encountered this situation myself. Going into A&E with my son who had an asthma attack. He has a formal diagnosis of asthma, and the A&E doctor stating to me that in this country, she said, because she asked if we'd had taken some measures to prevent it, and I spoke about using a nebulizer and so on, and she said, well, in this country, we don't do anything, and if there's a crisis, you bring your child to A&E. And ultimately, the treatment there seems to be, these corticosteroid, blue puffs, 20 odd puffs. Obviously, the little boy of 2 years was just bouncing around the room and had to go to the toilet every so often. But I just knew that wasn't correct information, because every time a child has a asthma attack, there's a possibility for scarification of the lungs, which will decrease lung volume over time. And also there is preventative medication, and Montelukast or maybe the brown inhalers, maybe not at the age of 2, but as of a certain age that can be considered, and it should prevent the child from having these acute crises, and also having yet another unnecessary A&E admission and visit, taking away resources from someone else.
So what that doctor was saying was that they won't treat something until it is a bad case.
That was said to me. So that is anecdotal, but I think that overall, if you work in the NHS for long enough, you tend to say to clients, well, this is the care package, and you kind of wrap it up as if it is the best care package.
This is what we can provide for you. When
actually you should say, no, clinically speaking, this is what should happen, but we don't have the resources to offer that to everyone that comes around here, and you're one of these people to whom we're not going to offer that. Why? Because we have resources to manage. And I think, clinicians, and myself included, perhaps you forget that what you're putting forward as in terms of the care package and the interventions and so on is about as well clinically, having a clinically sound opinion, but also, and that is not often recognized, you are managing resources at every level. The GP does that in terms of who do I refer on to a specialist. The specialist does it in terms of, and so everyone does it. And I think it's to the detriment of obviously the clinical care that should be offered to everyone, and would and should ultimately only be tailored to or consist of what is clinically the best approach to deal with this issue, and not how do we, kind of have a give and take approach to managing resources and, thinking clinically. And I think that's a problem. I really think it's a problem, and that ultimately it's the service user that pays the price. And for us, it is part of this kind of moral injury, in that you simply cannot provide the care that you think clinically is the most sound, because you're constantly having to manage resources.
And it's funny that you're from a mental health provision background, and children's and adolescent mental health is one of the ticking time bombs in terms of public health, and the number of child mental health presentations in an emergency department are just skyrocketing.
Exactly.
And so in terms of our 4-hour target, what can we do in A&E to support a child who is suicidal? We don't have the staff and resources to be providing that mental health support. You would think that somebody in mental health would be able to support. So in our mind, we would like to direct this child to somebody who can support them, because we are unable to do it. we have children languishing, and we're trying to find out what to do in addition to the road traffic accident that comes in. And so it is resource management. So over time, we talk about a death by 1,000 cuts. Every day, every patient, you are not providing the care you want. And that is moral distress. So it's exactly what it is. And people don't talk about it like that. People think about moral distress in the very big way. And, I've had cases of, very ethically challenging cases of, near death, of children at death, and the ethics of resuscitation, things like, those are the kind of very obvious moral injury cases. But it's these small ones, sustained repeatedly on a daily basis, death by 1,000 cuts. So I think that's important to acknowledge that as well.
Wow.
Yeah, in addition to, that kind of lack of validation of the impact on us by management, who also are under pressure by, the management above. But, you bring a case to a review, and then it's like, oh, no, we can't see that. Just go back to the family. And it's like, well, I'm still the one having to disappoint the family. And as you say, a death by 1,000 cuts. And in the end, that's it.
So, I mean, I can speak, I remember this didn't happen to me when I was a junior doctor very early on in my career. One of the things that I hated doing was telling a patient that their surgery is being cancelled. And, this is, 20 years ago in the health service. Of course, over 20 years, the pressures in the health service have changed. But even then, that, the patient has been waiting and, to being starved for anesthetic and prepared. And then for whatever reason, that has been cancelled. And in terms of efficiency, a lot of it relates to efficiency. A lot of it is not medical. A lot of it is IT. A lot of it is pure admin, logistics, organization. And if we think about how we could be more efficient, and again, going back to this not-for-profit business mentality, there could be a lot of achievements made, and we don't. And I really do believe about building blocks. Let's not try and be. This is why I'm an A&E doctor. I am not somebody looking to cure the very rare mitochondrial genetic disorder which affects 0.01% of the population. I'm not interested in space medicine. I'm interested in bog standard bread and butter stuff. And if we don't do that stuff well, then we have no foundation to do space medicine. We need to do the basic stuff well before moving on to the more advanced stuff.
Can I ask you both this then? Is there, for both of you, ever a point where you decide to go back to the NHS, and what would it would have to be under the conditions of what?
I mean, I really don't think I'm going to go back to the National Health Service in my career. I think I'm 45 now. I would probably think I've probably got another 20 years of working life left. I really do not think that transformational change is going to happen in that time, unless a government is brave enough to say that the funding structure and access needs to change. But as Emmanuel already said, the NHS is considered such a sacred cow that nobody wants to change anything about it, particularly anything. But if you look at in most other westernized healthcare system, none of them are an entirely state-funded system. And if we look at the rise in the provision of private healthcare services and use of private healthcare facilities, it is happening in the UK. And I'm just, sat there with my arms folded, drumming my fingers going, I'm just waiting in around 2035 when a government says, okay, I think we need to think about a different funding structure of the system. And it's the elephant in the room that it's the emperor has
no one wants to talk.
Nobody wants to talk about it. And again, I like to talk about the uncomfortable truth, which is why my company is called Behind Your Mask. And so a government, any government, and the NHS is such a revered public institution that any government thinks it's political suicide to think about radical NHS reform. When we come to talking about vulnerability and storytelling, we talk about this radical candor, this radical honesty. And until politicians are willing to have that radical conversation about, let's wipe the slate clean. What if we started again and looked about the provision of healthcare system for heading towards looking forward to a 22nd century, what would that look like?
Start the building blocks now.
Let's start now. Let's think about that. Unless people start thinking that way, in that big blue sky thinking, I don't think there's any point of thinking coming back to the NHS. But to answer your question, the answer is no. It's not because I don't care about healthcare and healthcare provision. It's just the environment in which you are to operate. It's worse.
And you?
Same. Unfortunately, same. There's tons of stuff I miss about the NHS, and it'll be the same. It's the, collegiality, like exemplary colleagues, that, the learning curve, and just how rich it is to work as a team compared to, which is more the case when you work privately, more isolated, more individually. There was just. And then in itself, the idea of having accessible healthcare, but even in other systems where it is not 100% state funded, there still is access to healthcare for everyone, regardless of your socioeconomic background. And this idea of the threshold being higher, I think, again, nothing is entirely good or bad. Maybe also having that, no thresholds to access the healthcare system takes a little bit away of the responsibility that people, should have in looking after their own health in the first place. It's a broad discussion,
I echo what you said. I have met we must acknowledge there are brilliant people working in the NHS, at all levels, whether it is in leadership, technical support, as well as the frontline people delivering healthcare. There are brilliant people with massive amounts of empathy and love and compassion and skills. And so the NHS is nothing without its people. And so, efforts to look after the workforce need to be really, really prioritized. But I just want to change track slightly in terms of, we've spoken a lot about the kind of like delivery to patients and the service users. But a part of what happened to me in the health service was about kind of like the non-clinical stuff, the kind of leadership and management. And I faced many challenges dealing with NHS leadership within hospitals, and this whole thing about being listened to and being heard. And I felt that even though I was a senior clinical leader within a tertiary institution, when raising my voice or amplifying my voice on certain difficult topics, might I add, to the leadership, it was almost shut down or not listened to. And I think after a time, when you start to question your own purpose, your own worth. I'm not an petulant child saying, I want, stamp my feet, I don't get what I want. But when you're actually just consistently not listened to. And so people may think, is this an isolated response? And I want to illustrate with when something went seriously wrong. The Lucy Letby case, where you had a neonatal nurse who unfortunately murdered a number of babies. And when there were suspicions by senior clinical leaders, consultants like myself, and raised it, the management didn't want to hear it and didn't want to listen. And in fact, actively went out to discredit the people who were the whistleblowers. And so what happened, there was at one point, one of the consultants who raised the main concern was made to write an apology by the management to the accused. And so that's all subsequently come out in the press when actually the accused was guilty. And
why?
You tell me. And so again, we go, and I think this alludes to what Emmanuel was saying, is about a culture where you are able to speak up. And they talk about this in the NHS, this freedom to speak up and whistleblowing and things. And this is not unique to healthcare. Being a whistleblower to serious problems that are compromising not just patient safety, but also staff safety, are often underplayed, swept under the carpet by senior management.
Is that just so they don't have to deal with it, or is that kind of an ego of management.
They may have a moral distress themselves.
that's the
They
thing,
may
yeah.
not have the resource or the capacity to deal
And
with the
it's just
gravity.
like, if we ignore it, hopefully it goes away.
To me, that's something I take away from my years the decade that I worked in NHS, is that, you would hear, for example, discontent within social services about, CAMS are not doing anything and so on. And then CAMS would say the same about social services, like, and I often had to say, hold on a minute. They are stressed out just the same as we. None of them have gone into that profession wanting to, twiddle their thumbs and see the money come in, so to speak. They're in moral distress just the same, and we need to be compassionate about that. Same for the schools that we work with, be it the SENCOs, so the special educational needs coordinators, or educational needs, specialists and education psychologists of all sorts. Everyone is under pressure, and so what translates is often is frustration and anger. That's what you see at face value. But anger to me is a secondary emotion. There's something underneath the anger, and that's obviously what needs to be discussed. I think a criticism that we often hear from the private sector is, the NHS staff are so precious, as if we in the private sector do not face, this difficulty of dealing with stress and conflict at work and having responsibility, which is true. But it is of a different nature, yeah. So if you'd ask me why are things swept under the carpet, again, whilst it's often displayed in the media as willfulness or neglect, or I think it's just what you see is not enough space and time to delve into additional work. And it's difficult enough for managers to manage all these different services, meet these targets, and have accountability to the management above. There's a multitude of layers in terms of management, but it's sad to say, but it is not willful neglect or people not caring. It really is just same conundrum. I only have a limited amount of time, and if you put this on my table, I just don't know how to deal with it.
So when we talk about trying to move things forward, so of course for the health service, the delivery of patient care is the priority. But in order to deliver that patient care, we need to, and deliver that quality, we need to provide education, as in we need to train people to deliver that quality care. And also, in order to make that care better, we need to say, what is the best evidence? We need to get, what is the best research? So you gave the example about asthma. We need to do research on best ways to prevent asthma attacks in children. And so that kind of education and research elements of being in the NHS are really important to drive things forward. But when you are completely eroded by just when I say simple act of trying to deliver patient care, education and research fall by the wayside. And so in a way, the NHS's inability to make better working conditions and streamline and be more efficient in the delivery of clinical care directly impacts on the quality of our teaching and training of our people coming through, and the research that we do to deliver that care. And the research in terms of care is not just in what's the best treatment for patients, it's also logistical, operational research. What best way can we channel mental health? What's the best way to resource mental health? It's not just, medical stuff. It is operational stuff. And I think the NHS needs to do a lot more operational research in terms of the current population of the UK and what the problems are and what the healthcare service needs to deliver. And so that's why I think about, what if we started again? Wipe the slate clean, start again. Could we?
That's a belief I have as well, in terms of there's been so much money thrown at the NHS, a multitude of, reorganizing stuff, ultimately usually just landing back to the original version of
money
things.
into it.
And if you were to want to move forward, my sense would be that it would make sense to start building a parallel system from the ground up, whilst continuing to run the NHS, and then at the right time, transposing it into this new, because it's the foundation, it's a foundational issue, it's a systemic issue, and you, again, I fear that you can throw as much money as you want at the NHS. if systemically it is just no longer fit for purpose because the foundations are no longer right, then you need to look at the parallel system.
So I want to go back to something that you'd said, that actually, we need to be compassionate to our collaborators that we deal with. So you talked about social care, you talked about education. For me, I pay much respect to my colleagues in primary care and GPs, because, we can all sit there and complain saying all these patients who should be seen in GP are coming to us, but they are under pressure. So I absolutely acknowledge what you're saying about that.
You couldn't pay me any money to be a GP.
Yeah, but
you really couldn't.
I have much respect for them. I couldn't do their job. But going back to along those lines, why are those people stressed? And that touches on something that I talk about, which is called workplace incivility. So things like bullying, harassment, discrimination. A lot of these workplace incivilities are fueled by these adverse working conditions.
Sure.
And so, again, this is kind of perpetuating thing. The system is built as such to really stress our staff. And then what happens is our staff are incivil, not just to the service users. Generally, they are good to the service users, but it can spill over. But the people that they are most uncivil to are their colleagues. And so this absolutely perpetuates this kind of
domino effect.
Yes, this kind of cesspit of workplace incivility and toxic work culture. And so, again, going back to why is it that these outstandingly caring CQC rated employees, less than half than people recommend the place to work? Is this partly because of workplace moral distress, moral injury? But is a lot of it due to undisclosed workplace incivility? And a lot of the work that I've done in the health service is actually getting staff to talk about the incivilities that they have faced. And it is not from patients all the time.
Well, let's try and end on a lighter note.
Yeah.
And tell us a bit about you, what you now do behind the mask, and how it fits perfectly into obviously what we've discussed today.
So you asked me about how I got into storytelling. Actually, it was from my own adverse experience as a trainee doctor with moral distress and moral injury, where I had a quite profound ethical dilemma where I was not listened to about the care that I wanted to provide to a particular patient. That led me to have quite serious mental health problems. I actually went to my GP thinking that I had a brain tumor, and they suggested that it was workplace stress. I went to occupational health and spoke to a counsellor about it, and they were right. It was related to that very ethically challenging case. And what they advised me to do was to go to something called a Schwartz round, which is a storytelling session where people share stories about the social and emotional impact of their work. And it's something quite well established in North America and is also here in many NHS trusts in the UK. And I went and I listened to other people's stories, and I found it very healing and very cathartic. I then volunteered to share my story about that particularly challenging case, and people came up to me saying, "You have articulated something that I have struggled with in my career but never had the eloquence to say out in public, or the confidence to say out in public." And so that's when I realized actually this creation of this space for staff to share stories about whatever is affecting them in their work life could be very, very useful. So when I came to the hospital that I worked in, where this mismatch between staff engagement and providing quality care, we kickstarted the Schwartz rounds, and and then during the pandemic, we shifted it online to support staff dealing with the traumas of the pandemic. And over the 5 years that I was doing this, we won 3 national awards in staff engagement. We ended up in a Tate Liverpool painting. A painter was inspired to paint us because we were advocating for staff well-being using stories. And I was interviewed on BBC and things. And so when it came to my appraisal, and I was thinking, I've won 3 national awards in staff engagement, and been in a Tate Liverpool painting, and been interviewed by the BBC for something which is technically not in my job plan. And so when you start thinking, maybe that should be my job plan. And so here I am. I set up a business focusing on focused on helping people get behind their professional mask and share stories on anything, comfortable or uncomfortable. And that's what I'm passionate about. And I have clients in many sectors, ranging from performing arts to city law firms, to finance, to international schools, and anybody, any organization which employs people, if you are passionate about your people and you are interested in the engagement and health and well-being of your workforce, you consider stories and safe spaces where these stories can be shared, that can be used to educate and engage and inspire. That's what I do.
I love it. I think we've got to end on that. Is there anything that you'd like to, social media, things like that you'd like to put out there, you'd like people to follow, or just take a look at? Websites? We can link all your stuff below anyway.
I have a website. It's behindyourmask.co. Everybody asks me, why is it not .com.co.uk? It's .co. And on there I have my LinkedIn, Instagram, and X.
Perfect.
So people can look at that. But but it's not just about business. If you are interested in your personal story and comfortable or uncomfortable, this is all about. It's about connecting as humans. So whether you're a business, whether an individual, whether you're a media, it's all about stories.
Thank you very much for coming on. Anything else from you?
No, thanks so much, Lilath. I really appreciate it, and hope to meet up with you more at the swimming pool here as well. Yeah.
So yes, swimming, good for well-being. And again, I digest a lot of the stories that my clients tell me, some of which is pretty heavy. And so swimming early in the morning is what sets me up for the day and helps me digest what's happened the day before.
Go swimming, people. Thank you very much.